You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. This is another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I'm your host, Doug Thorpe. You know, it's time to take a dive into the more complex side of running a business or owning a business. If your business gets big enough, you're going to want to think about having a board, and there's all kinds of compliance possibilities that come with that. Even if you're privately held, there are angles and aspects you may want to think about. And if you're not yet there building a board, my guest today is going to help share some ideas and thoughts. His name is Tom Fox. Tom, welcome to the show.
Doug, thanks. A real pleasure and honor to be here with you today.
Yeah, you know, Tom, is a little bit of a tradition. Tell everybody a little bit of your backstory, kind of what your journey has involved and how is it you've got into what you're doing now.
So I'm a lawyer by professional training. In September, I will attend my 40th law school reunion. So I've been doing it a while. I'm also, within that, I'm a recovering trial lawyer. I did that for 25 years.
Wow.
Then I went to the in-house world and did contracts, got to live abroad and do contracts on every continent, save Antarctica, but I will remedy that at some point. And then I moved into the area of anti-bribery and anti-corruption compliance. And I've been in that field for the last 15 years.
Well, I know that's an area that has gotten a lot of attention in the last number of years, and I know I myself get involved from time to time in some large global contract platform activities, and they always ask each one of us to go through an anti-bribery, anti-money laundering, the risks and challenges of sometimes dealing abroad. There are undercurrents that suggest business practices that you may not normally agree to or practice. And knowing what's fair and what's foul is a really important thing. But you are running your own show, your own podcast, I believe, and tell us a little more about your target audience there.
Sure. So I actually have two podcast networks. So I'm trying to make a business out of this. The first one is in the area that I just mentioned, anti-corruption compliance. It's expanded out to more general legal and regulatory compliance. That's called the Compliance Podcast Network. And then I live in the hill country of West Texas, just outside of Kerrville. And so I started the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network, where I'm trying to bring a podcast network to a rural area and see if that can be a viable business model for a podcast network by delivering basically social media marketing content for local businesses, as well as news and other podcasts of interest.
Fascinating. And I'm a fan of the latter, as most of my listeners know. I too am a Texas boy, and the Texas Hill Country is a great destination, and specifically the area that Tom is talking about, the Kerrville area and Fredericksburg and places such as that, in really the heart of Texas geographically. It is quite an area. There's been a lot of growth and a lot of new movement and activity, and we have our own wine country of sorts there, and I know that's an attraction that many follow, and there's some good beverages being brewed out of there.
That there are.
Yeah, neat. Well, let's, I tell you what, let's camp out a minute on just your own journey of building a business and building those podcasts. Would you mind sharing some of the trials and travails that you've experienced and figured out how to overcome?
Sure. So I started podcasting as an outgrowth of blogging. I started podcasting in 2012. I was at that point practicing law in the area of anti-corruption compliance, and I had started a blog in 2010, largely as a marketing outreach, but it pretty quickly grew won a few awards, and I discovered that it greatly increased my thought leadership profile and specific subject matter expertise because I had to research something to do a blog. Well, then I started a podcast, and it turned out the podcast was equally powerful for me in learning and as a marketing tool. In 2017, I got the bright idea that I would start a podcast network, once again, focusing on anti-corruption compliance. There were 4 big players in the space back then. So I went to every one of them and said, hey, let's create this, basically a consortium, and we will be the only podcast network delivering information for the compliance professional in the podcast format. And we can be a great resource, and I could get zero interest. So I just decided to do it myself. I plugged away for a couple of years, and in 2019, I decided to fully commit to it. So I took the year off from practicing law, bought all the cool toys, built this huge infrastructure. And at the end of the year, I'd made about $10,000. I thought, well, that was an interesting experiment. I have to go back to practicing law and make some money. And that lasted until March of 2020 when they shut the country down because of COVID. And about 2 months later, I got a call literally from every product provider in the compliance space with the same question, which was, how long to get access to your network? Because almost all marketing in compliance was done in person, either conferences, trade shows, breakfast roundtables, speeches, etc. And of course, no one could do that back then. And by that time, I had 30,000 daily followers on social media. I had the only podcast network. And my answer to all of them was 24 hours. But that was a direct result of having done all the work the year before. One of my favorite phrases is when preparation meets opportunity, luck occurs. And I got very, very lucky.
Right.
But if I hadn't done the work in 2019, I wouldn't have gotten lucky. So my little world blew up. I went to over 2 million hits and downloads on the network in 2020. And since that time, I've been trying to consolidate that growth and see if I can, make a permanent, viable business model out of the compliance B2B podcast network.
Fabulous. Well, congratulations on that. And there's a couple of, I think, key learning points that you covered there. And I'll share this in mind. I'll put on my coaching hat for those that are listening and trying to start businesses. Sometimes your idea feels like a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. As Tom described, he thought it was a great idea, went out to the people that should have been players, and they all turned him down. But he felt committed to it, went ahead and went independently to build and move the model forward. And then that opportunity did strike with the whole COVID lockdown, and there he was, fully prepared, fully ready. And I presume in part of that preparation, Tom, you had a couple of false starts. You probably had a few glitches in your system, your network, everything from the connectivity to editing and production and all those things, but you had overcome them by that point.
Right. And I remember in the fall of the year before, in 2019, there's 2 major podcast conferences in the United States, and I went to the fall one. And I had these fabulous numbers, and I was convinced I'd get lots of sponsorships and advertisers, and I could get no one interested. And because all they heard was legal and regulatory compliance, who's interested in that? And I was so discouraged. And I remember I even left early. I was so discouraged. But on my way out, I said goodbye to a friend of mine, and he just put his arm around me and said, "You just keep doing what you're doing. It's going to pay off." And he was right. And, 6 months later, my little world blew up.
Wow. Well, that's great. And again, congratulations on that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the arena. And as you said, there are some that are going to hear the words compliance and regulatory oversight, and they're going to, kind of gag and probably hit the delete button here. But I'm okay with that. I think for those that want to hear it and need to hear it, they'll hang with us. I have a particular bias in that space, being an old, lifelong, and I love your phrase. You said you're a recovering trial lawyer. I'm a recovering banker. So I've spent too many years around the conference table where there was a regulatory and compliance matter at hand, that some challenge that had been put forth, or more importantly, some radical change that had been announced that nobody could understand or nobody knew about. And for me, my high water mark was the infamous Dodd-Frank Act of 2011, 10 or 11, I guess.
2010.
2010, yeah. And, that sent shockwaves through the part of the industry that I was associated with at the time. And I can remember going to many different workshops and conferences of folks speaking and trying to make sense of a very confusing regulation that was put out. And, eventually the dust settled and everybody found their new normal and it was all good. But talk to us a little bit about, I guess, the life cycle of those things.
Sure. So modern compliance actually started back in the mid-90s when they passed the U.S. sentencing guidelines, federal sentencing guidelines for corporations. And in those guidelines, they would give credit, which would reduce your sentence if you had a corporate compliance program in place. So that sort of hummed along. And the major change was a little bit before Dodd-Frank, and that, of course, came out of WorldCom and Enron, and that was Sarbanes-Oxley. Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, applied to public corporations. Dodd-Frank, as you correctly noted, largely applied to the financial industry going forward. All of this is overlaid by the United States was the first country to pass an anti-corruption law, and that was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act back in 1977. That outlawed U.S. companies from engaging in bribery and corruption outside the United States. That law was in place. Sarbanes-Oxley required corporations to certify financial results and financial filings, and that's SOX 404. And then Dodd-Frank came in and strengthened up the AML and other reporting requirements for banks. And that really led to sort of an explosion of growth in compliance programs in the 2010s. And we all sort of have learned from each other, meaning public companies have learned from banks because banks had to focus on anti-money laundering and got very, very good at that. U.S. public corporations didn't focus on that really until recently. They focused on anti-corruption compliance. And now, starting with the Trump administration and into the Biden administration after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, export control and trade sanctions are the biggest sort of compliance areas. So we've had this convergence of various areas of compliance, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, trade sanctions. Now it's just under the umbrella of compliance.
Well, and as I just add one more layer in there, as I recall, a lot of the focus on anti-money laundering was not purely criminal related, but also ramped up as a result of 9/11.
Yes,
there was a very real evidence of money moving through financial institutions that funded that effort. And therefore, the regulators came in with a pretty heavy hand, as they should have, I think, and set up parameters for know your customer and a lot of those other kinds of buzzwords that have permeated the banking world.
I met with a banker in Kerrville last week and sort of told him what I did. And when I said compliance, you could almost see the eyes roll inside his head. He goes, "Yeah, I know about compliance." And even in a regional bank in Kerrville, it was, front of mind for what he has to do in terms of the reporting of the bank. And as you said, it's not simply not even terrorism and money laundering, but, $5,000 is now above that is a suspicious activity report has to be filed, whether it's suspicious or not. That's just a amount the government set that they won't notice about. So it's as ubiquitous a requirement as there can be.
Yeah. Well, and I do not want to politicize our discussion here at all, but some have gone so far as to challenge the so-called overreach of government, getting us to set some of these standards, like you say, even the suspicious activity reports banks have to file. It used to be 10,000, now it's down to 5, and some folks who have a good sized business, they might have a reason to want 5 or 10,000 in cash to do something, and yet now that's deemed potentially suspicious. So it's a challenge. And for those of you that are running businesses out there, if your bankers ask you to fill out some extra paperwork when you've asked for that cash withdrawal, that's what it's all about.
Absolutely.
So, Tom, and as you continue your consulting and advisory work, can you share some of the nature of the projects that you're working on? I don't need to name names, but can you just share some of the examples?
Sure. So, most compliance revolves around something along the lines of know your customer, know your client, know your vendor, know the people you're doing business with. So that the general requirement around that is background due diligence. And so I do a lot of projects around that, helping companies set up programs. When I went out on my own in 2010 as a lawyer, I decided I really enjoyed building out compliance programs. So I wanted to be the nuts and bolts guy. I didn't want to do investigations, and I'm not an ex-prosecutor, so I didn't think I should sit on the other side of a table from a prosecutor in some type of enforcement action. But I really enjoyed building out compliance programs because I see those as business processes. So I try to help companies see that compliance is a business process. And if you create a good business process, you can actually make your company more efficient and hopefully at the end of the day, more profitable. So who are you doing business with? How are you doing business? Where are you doing business? I help companies build out programs around that, training and investigation in the life cycle of a third-party risk management. I mentioned the due diligence, but that's just one part. You have to have a contract in place, but then you have to manage that relationship afterwards, whether that's through audit or other monitoring to make sure your third parties are not violating any of your policies. Training and communication, kind of a hot topic right now from the regulators is clawbacks from executives who either violated compliance rules and regulations or sort of buried their head in the sand and should have known. So we're trying to determine, can you actually claw back someone's bonus or other discretionary compensation? You cannot claw back salary. But if someone got a stock option or a bonus or something, and you claw that back. And then leadership, including tone at the top, getting senior management buy-in, and above that is the role of the board of directors in compliance. And here we've had some very firm guidance from the Delaware courts. Most U.S. companies are domiciled or not headquartered, but formed in Delaware. So Delaware corporate law governs. And the Delaware courts, starting with their trial court all the way to their Supreme Court, have created obligations for boards of directors for compliance. So I help boards understand their role in a best practices compliance program, and really starting with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now whatever the state of our relationships with China is, try to convince boards that yes, it's compliance, but it's also risk management.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know I can speak to that a little bit on from my consulting days. I had more than several opportunities to work with a risk management framework and model that the whole compliance and regulatory consistency was one element. In this particular model, it was one of 8 potential areas of risk management that needed to be addressed. And the model we used was to go in and work with a company and evaluate the maturity of their risk management effort in each of those 8 areas. So, and then a very well-developed level of maturity meant that you had connection with your board. There were designated board members that had oversight on certain elements, and there were a lot of layers to the whole program. So very interesting. In something you said there about systematizing this ability for a company to comply, a thought came through my mind. There was a legal practice I was taught as in my days as a banker, and that was that if your company gets challenged on a transaction, if you can demonstrate that you have a standard practice of dealing with that transaction in a certain way, that helps strengthen your defense of whatever may have happened, obviously, unless that practice was bad to start with. But, for instance, I'm thinking of an element like we only keep paper copies a certain amount of time, and otherwise everything is digitized. And that digital record is our source of truth for our company. And so demonstrating that to a court of law, you don't necessarily have to show up with the paper and the original document, but you have to demonstrate that that is a standard practice, that that's how you do things.
So I talk a lot, as you might guess, about compliance, and every speech I give, I say the following. The 3 most important things in any best practice compliance program are the following: document, document, document. Whatever you do, document it. Because if you have a great process and program, but you haven't documented it and you haven't documented the transaction, in regulators' eyes, it never happened.
Yep.
And we have a couple of pretty stark examples of FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, enforcement actions, where the companies did have a robust program in place, but they didn't have the documentation to show they followed it. So every transaction can be defended if you have a business justification for doing it, whether it's with a business venture partner, whether a commission sales agent, or just a sale. And if you have a business rationale or business justification, whatever your process is, as you said, did you follow that process? And can you document that? And if you can show that, you will almost always be able to satisfy a regulator, whether it's background due diligence, whether it's a sale, whether it's a transaction, whether it's a something.
Yeah. So I think, again, the takeaway for business owners out there that might be listening to this, it is that establishment of the process, and as Tom has added, documenting that process. And I think I would go so far to add that includes the training of your personnel to know where that documentation is about the process and how to follow it and what the requirements are. And then ultimately the record keeping on that transaction or that event that happened. And all of those things are necessary. And if you keep doing what I'll call one-off transactions, you are digging a giant hole.
You're digging yourself a giant hole. But the other thing is, and I ask people to think about, particularly young entrepreneurs who may be solo or small companies. Yes, you can do one-off transactions, but what happens if, like happened to me, you get a call from every product provider in your space? How can you scale up? And if you don't have the processes in place, you can create them, but you're creating 40,000 feet in the air, going 8,000 miles an hour or 4,000 miles an hour in a jet. And could I have done that in my podcast, Entrepreneurship? I don't know, but I don't have to answer that question because I had the processes in place and I could immediately scale up. So that's one of the messages I try to communicate from my experience, that no matter how small you are, put those processes in place. And whether that's a financial process, because you may become a public company very, very quickly. or someone may come along and say, we like you, we want to buy you. Let's see your processes and your documentation. Well, if you can show that, you have created a market differentiator for your business.
Right. Well, and that ability to demonstrate that also adds to the ultimate value of your company that you've built if those bigger players come knocking, whether it's venture capital or other businesses wanting to buy you. The more that you've already done that work and got all that in place, the ultimate value of your exit increases, sometimes substantially, because a potential suitor may like your business idea. They may like the niche that you've created in the marketplace. But if they come lift the covers and they realize it's all a wing and a prayer and there's not much of a process, and if you go away, they have nothing, well, guess what? Your valuation just went through the floor.
Right.
And that is a sometimes hard lesson that entrepreneurs struggle with from time to time. They know they want to sell. They know they want to have a lucrative exit of some sort, but they haven't done this preparatory work. They haven't put the systems in place. They haven't done the training. They don't have the documentation. And to me, there's a simple test. If you're a business owner out there, can you walk away from your business for a month and not lose any money?
That's a great test.
And if the answer to that is no, you either, and there's nothing wrong, by the way, with having a sole proprietorship and you choose to shut it down for a month. And if you can do that and pick back up after that month, that's your choice. But if you really are striving to build a business that has scalable, saleable value, you've got to pass that test. And plain and simple, I've had a few folks try to argue with me on that point, but it's like, isn't that the point? You're wanting to exit, as in get your money and go do something else? Well, if you can't temporarily walk away, you certainly cannot permanently walk away.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Tom, for many of these issues that you have your expertise doing and helping people, what are the various stages that a young up-and-coming company starts to feel the need for this kind of expertise?
Well, let me go back to Sarbanes-Oxley and the financial controls. And I think the earlier you can put SOX, financial controls, in place, the better off your corporation is going to be. Number one, the rigor that's required. Two, obviously, the policies and procedures that we've talked about, and how everyone kind of knows the rules in the organization. But three, I think it's a true market differentiator. And it demonstrates you as a serious player in whatever your space is. So I tell people, particularly around financial controls, and compliance controls are really just a subset of financial controls. So once you have SOX 404 controls in place, you have about 98% of the compliance controls you need. And you bring in somebody like me to fill in the last 2 to 5%. It's not hard, it's not expensive, and it's not a long process, generally. So get your financial controls in place, because that really demonstrates to the world you are a serious business, and you are a serious business opportunity if you want to cash out at some point.
Yeah. And I might add that both in terms of contract due diligence, and ultimately, I know there are those out there that maybe have a dream and desire to be able to land government contracts. Well, if you want to enter the government contract game, it starts with a registration on the sam.gov database. And I think the terminology for that's changed a little bit. But in qualifying your business for that, there are pages and pages and litanies of reference points on compliance issues that have to be attested to and documented. So, that is kind of the point of entry for that game, if that's, where you're going. And if you If you check the box, yes, I attest to this, and then they subsequently discover, no, you don't have that in place, obviously you're disqualified, but it can lead to other more serious penalties.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it gets to be a very delicate thing. But so back to your statement on the financial controls, I tend to think about, and I talk to business owners about this, that there are clearly stages in the life of a company. So you're an entrepreneur, you get this great idea, you go through the startup phase, and then you get a little traction, you go into a bit of an expansion phase, you got more opportunity, you grow the company a bit, and the success of that gets you some real traction that can propel you into that, what some call a takeoff phase. And that's where the jet climbs up to the 10,000 feet and then is flying at whatever speed. And that is often too late a time to start developing these things. Not to say it can't be done, but it sure becomes more difficult when that's going on. And then ultimately there's a potential kind of enterprise phase. And that's typically where I see the more formalization of board structures and a lot more documentation on policy, procedures, et cetera, and definitely a bigger expansion of the leadership team of the company. It's not just the founder anymore. There's usually a designation of some roles, possibly even CEO or COO added to the leadership suite. But and that's, I guess, where I'm going, Tom, is the question. So if I'm an entrepreneur and I built my little company up and I'm running it, I don't know, let's pick a number, let's say 5 million annual, do I really need to worry about much of this stuff?
I would be scared to death if I made $5 million and I didn't have controls in place. Because one, I think you need to have those controls in place for your government reporting, i.e. taxes, and any state reporting you may have to do. So I think, and the example of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried is there for everyone. Well, what happens if you hit the biggest home run in the history of the world ever, and you don't have those controls in place? And that's when he did. And he had no controls in place. He had no financial accounting in place. It was the worst disaster ever, according to the bankruptcy trustee, and that's the guy that did Enron. So I think that's a great example. But at 5 million, it just demonstrates the seriousness of what you do and the efficiencies of what you can bring as a business if you have those controls in place. And it sets the culture, it sets the tone for the organization. And if you want to grow your organization, whether dramatically or steady, slow, steady growth, it gives you the foundation to do so. Right.
Well, I agree totally. And for me, putting my old banker hat on, when I look at a business that doesn't have some of those controls, I go so far as to tell clients, you may not even be bankable if you can't demonstrate those controls. Forget compliance, forget regulation, forget all those things. Your deal may not be bankable. You may want to go get a working capital line of credit. And if you can't demonstrate some of those controls to your banker, they're not going to take you in because they have standards they have to follow. And
exactly. And what I tell people, not just entrepreneurs, but all the way up the organization, you may not be able to access the cash in your organization if you don't have those financial controls in place. And as you get larger, you may not be able to access your business partners or other opportunities if you don't have compliance controls in place. And we just moved out to the Hill Country a couple of years ago, and I was in Houston for most of my professional career. And in the energy space, if you didn't have a compliance program in place, you were not going to do business in the energy industry because every company required that of a business partner, of a customer, of a vendor, of a joint venture partner,
right,
in a position that was auditable or documented.
Right, right. Yeah, that whole vendor management spectrum for those really large and obviously mostly publicly traded companies, that did become a requirement. That was a subject of their audits, and the whole vendor management space blew up. And I'm going to say in the late 80s, I think, early 90s, as I recall it. And if you were an entrepreneur, which I was, I opened a shop in the late 90s, and trying to prove myself compliant to win even some of those contracts. It wasn't a government deal, but it was working with large publicly traded companies. There were times I couldn't pass some of the early qualification hurdles to get in as an approved vendor for them. And again, part of it actually, as I recall, did come back to being able to evidence some financial control and some other things that at the time I personally didn't really want to disclose to anybody. And so I had to pay the price by not getting the contract to do that. So it's a slippery slope for the entrepreneur for sure. But I guess, what's the phrase? Come early and go often, or something like that. When it comes to these compliance issues, I think that's the version of the bottom line that I'm getting from you, Tom.
It makes your company not simply more marketable, but stronger. And that's why I started off saying that effective compliance equates to more efficient business processes, which creates a greater ROI. So I see a direct causal relationship between effective compliance and greater profitability.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, I think this has been great, Tom. Tell everybody the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in knowing more.
Sure. So you can check out my profile on LinkedIn. You want more information on the podcast realm, I have the Compliance Podcast Network, which is www.compliancepodcastnetwork.net. I'm happy to visit with anyone. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com, or you can give me a shout the old-fashioned way on the phone at 832-744-0264.
Well, that's great, Tom. And again, one last time, thank you so much for sitting in. And as always, folks, we'll have that information that Tom just shared in the show notes. So please do take a look if you are interested, and take a listen on his show and his network. Really good help. And I'm sitting here thinking for a lot of my entrepreneur clients, they're probably thinking, oh, great. Thank you, Doug. Now I got one more thing I've got to go do. But this is a critical one, and not to be taken lightly. And it should become part of a much bigger strategic plan that you've got to address these issues, put the right procedures and documentation in place, and above all, then follow what you write when you develop it, and know that that's part of the test as well. So,
and Doug, I wanted to thank you, because I really don't get to talk to entrepreneurs enough about these basic needs. I talk to a lot of corporations, senior execs, boards of directors, but I really want entrepreneurs to understand it will make your company run better, and it will make it more marketable.
Right. I think that's a great summation here. And you would have been a good attorney to have on the team back in the day. Thanks, Tom. I laugh sometimes. I tell my wife I have been accused of being an attorney more often than not. I've been in a lot of discussions and been around the big conference table and going toe-to-toe with attorneys. And I've even had guys take me off in the hallway and go, "Where'd you go to law school?" I go, "It's hard knocks, buddy. Nothing I said is legally binding." And I want to make that clear on this show too. But unlike Tom, I am not a licensed attorney, and please do not take anything I say as legal advice. But I know enough to say that. So how about that?
Sounds good.
All right, folks. Well, we're going to wrap this up. I do want to remind everybody we've got a video version of this over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Hop over there. We've got a lot of goodies for you, a lot of special treats, and the whole archive of all of our shows. We're coming up on number 200 pretty quickly here. So looking forward to having you join us over there. For now, we're going to sign off, say goodbye, and tell you to have a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.